They called it the stupidest chimney in the Adirondacks. 2 flues where one belonged. Fieldstone stacked in a pattern that made no sense to anyone who looked at it, and a schoolteacher insisting it would burn half the wood and keep a cabin warmer. When the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit that January, most folks figured he would freeze first and apologize second. Every other family in the valley was splitting wood in the dark, feeding stoves that barely kept the frost off the inside walls. Children slept in coats. Water buckets froze solid overnight. The cold did not care about pride or tradition. It broke chimneys, cracked logs, and turned poorly insulated cabins into ice traps. The problem was not the cold itself. It was the fuel disappearing faster than anyone could cut it, and the slow realization that February was still 6 weeks away. The builder was a schoolteacher who spent his summers reading engineering journals and his winters testing ideas nobody asked for. He believed heat moved in patterns people ignored, that most of what families burned went straight up into the sky, and that a chimney built correctly could do the work of 2 stoves. His neighbors thought he was wasting time. The town official told him directly that experimenting with chimneys during a hard winter was reckless. That opinion did not stop him. Neither did the mockery. The question was not whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. The Adirondacks in winter were unforgiving. Families who ran out of firewood before spring either moved in with relatives or lost fingers to frostbite trying to keep up. Wood was currency. A family could burn through 4 cords between December and March if the winter was mild. In a hard winter, that number doubled. The usual approach was straightforward: a single flue chimney, a cast iron stove, and constant feeding. The heat rose fast, escaped through the roof, and left the floor cold enough to ache. People accepted it because everyone did it the same way. Complaining was pointless. Then, January showed up. The Double-Flue design started as a sketch in a notebook. 2 separate channels running side by side inside the same stone structure. The first flue carried smoke and heat straight up from the firebox, the way any normal chimney did. The second flue ran parallel, but drew cold air from the base of the cabin, pulled it down into a buried stone channel beneath the floor, and then pushed it back up through the chimney as preheated air. The idea was simple: use the Earth's constant temperature to warm incoming air before it ever reached the fire, and use the fire's exhaust heat to finish the job. The execution was complicated. The helper was a younger man who worked at the general store and had steady hands. He did not care much about theory, but he liked building things that nobody else understood. He showed up most evenings after his shift, helped mix mortar, and asked questions that forced the builder to explain every step twice. The skeptic was the town official responsible for inspecting cabins after structure failures. He had seen 3 chimneys crack that winter, 2 families forced to evacuate, and 1 roof fire started by a desperate attempt to overheat a failing stove. When he heard about the Double-Flue experiment, he walked through snow up to his knees to see it himself. The skeptic said it looked like 2 chimneys that started a fight and got stuck together. He said the second flue would pull heat away from the firebox and make the whole cabin colder. He said the stone channel under the floor would crack in the freeze and flood the cabin with smoke. He said if the builder wanted to burn half his firewood, he could just throw the other half in the creek and save himself the trouble. The builder thanked him for stopping by. Ridicule did not stop the cold. The underground channel was the hardest part. It ran 8 feet from the base of the chimney to a point beneath the center of the cabin floor. The ground was frozen 18 inches down. Digging took 4 days. The builder used a pickaxe to break the frost layer, then shovels to clear the trench. The helper hauled fieldstone from a collapsed wall half a mile away, dragging it on a sled through snow that came up to his waist. They lined the trench with flat stones, mortared the joints, and covered the top with split logs before backfilling with gravel and dirt. The builder explained it to the helper in plain terms. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. In a normal cabin, cold air pools on the floor and stays there until someone opens a door or a draft pulls it toward the stove. By the time it reaches the fire, it is so cold that the flames have to work twice as hard to heat it. That wastes fuel. The preheat channel pulled that cold air down into the ground, where the earth stayed at a constant 45 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, let it warm up to something closer to useful, and then fed it into the second flue, where the rising heat from the firebox finished the job. The air entering the fire was already halfway warm. That was the difference. The chimney itself rose 12 feet above the roofline. The two flues ran parallel, separated by a double-thickness stone wall to prevent heat transfer. The firebox at the base was wider than standard, designed to burn slower and hotter. The builder installed a cast iron damper on the primary flue to control draft, and a second damper on the preheat flue to regulate how much cold air entered the system. The whole structure weighed close to 2 tons. When the first fire was lit, smoke poured out of both flues, the dampers rattled, and the helper asked if they had just built the world's most expensive way to freeze to death. The builder adjusted the dampers, waited 10 minutes, and lit it again. This time the smoke rose clean, and the firebox settled into a low, steady burn. The helper put his hand near the floor vent where the preheat air entered. It was noticeably warmer than the air coming under the door. Not hot, just warm enough to prove the system was moving. The skeptic came back a week later. The builder offered to show him the temperature difference between the floor near the vent and the floor near the door. The skeptic said he did not need a tour of a room that would be frozen solid by February. He asked how much wood the builder had burned in the past 7 days. The builder said 1.5 cords. The skeptic said his own cabin had burned 2 cords in the same period, and his children were still sleeping in coats. He did not say anything else. He just looked at the chimney for a long time, and then walked back to town. By mid-January, the cold snap arrived. Temperatures dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 6 days. The valley went quiet. Families stopped visiting each other. The general store closed early because the stove could not keep the building warm enough to prevent the ink from freezing. People burned furniture when they ran low on firewood. The town official made his rounds, checking cabins for structural failures and frostbite cases. He found ice on the inside of windows in 14 homes. He found 2 families sharing one cabin because their own chimneys had cracked. He found children with blue fingers huddled under every blanket they owned. Then he checked the schoolteacher's cabin. The fire was burning low, 1 log in the firebox, barely glowing. The builder was sitting at his table in shirt sleeves, writing lesson plans. The helper was drinking coffee without mittens. The skeptic walked to the window and touched the glass. It was clear. No frost. No ice. He asked what the indoor temperature was. The builder said he did not have a thermometer, but he estimated it was around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The skeptic asked how much wood he had burned that day. The builder said 2 logs since dawn. It was nearly sunset. The skeptic did not argue. He asked if he could sit down. The builder poured him coffee. The skeptic said every other cabin in the valley was burning 4 times as much wood and staying half as warm. He said people were going to start asking questions. The builder said people had been asking questions since October, and the only thing that changed their minds was the cold. The skeptic said he needed to see the system work through the rest of the winter before he would say anything publicly. But if it held, he would tell the county office himself. That was the first time anyone had called it anything other than stupid. The helper asked what happened if the preheat channel froze. The builder said it could not freeze because the earth below the frost line stayed at 45 degrees year-round, and the constant airflow from the cabin kept it even warmer. The skeptic asked what happened if the chimney cracked. The builder said the double wall design distributed expansion stress across more surface area, so it was actually less likely to crack than a single-flue chimney. The skeptic asked what happened if the firebox burned too hot and overheated the preheat air. The builder said the dampers controlled that, and the system was designed to fail safe. If the preheat flue got too hot, you just closed its damper and the chimney worked like a normal single-flue system. The math was simple. A standard cabin burned 6 logs per day in extreme cold. The double-flue system burned 3. Over a 4-month winter, that was the difference between 8 cords and 4 cords. 4 cords was 2 weeks of cutting for one man. It was money saved. It was time saved. It was the difference between running out in February and having wood left over in March. The skeptic asked if the system worked in a larger cabin. The builder said the principle scaled, but the channel length and flue diameter had to increase proportionally. The helper asked if you could retrofit an existing chimney. The builder said no. The preheat channel had to be built into the foundation. You could not add it later without tearing up the floor. By the end of January, 3 neighbors had asked to see the system. The builder walked them through it step by step. He showed them the trench, the dampers, the flue separation, and the temperature difference at the floor vents. One of them said he would try it when he built his new cabin in the spring. Another said he did not have time to dig a trench, but he liked the idea of a slower burning firebox. The third said it sounded complicated, and he would rather just cut more wood. The builder said that was fair. Not everyone needed the same solution. February brought 2 more cold snaps. The first dropped temperatures to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 days. The second hit minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 72 hours. The town official made his rounds again. This time, he found frost on the inside of every window he checked except one. He found families burning green wood because they had run out of seasoned timber. He found 2 cabins abandoned because the occupants had moved to town. He found one man trying to insulate his walls with newspaper and frozen mud. Then, he checked the schoolteacher's cabin again. The fire was still burning low. The builder was still in shirt sleeves. The windows were still clear. The skeptic asked how much wood had been burned in the past week. The builder said he had used 1 1/4 cords since the start of February. The skeptic said he had burned 3 cords in the same period, and his cabin was still cold enough to see his breath indoors. He said the difference was 59 degrees Fahrenheit between outside and inside, and the double-flue system was holding that gap with 73% less fuel than a standard setup. He said those were not opinions. They were measurements. The helper said people were going to call it luck. The skeptic said let them. He said 7 families had already asked him about the design, and he had told all of them the same thing. It worked, because the builder understood that heat moved in patterns, and most people just guessed. The builder said it worked because he had tested it, adjusted it, and built it carefully. The helper said it worked because they had spent 4 days digging a trench in frozen ground and nobody else wanted to do that. All three of them were right. The turning point was quiet. No dramatic announcement. No public meeting. Just the slow realization that one cabin in the valley was using half the firewood and staying warmer than every other structure within 10 miles. People noticed. The general store owner asked the builder to sketch the system on the back of a feed order. A man from 2 valleys over rode through a snowstorm to see it with his own eyes. The skeptic told the county office that the Double-Flue design was the most efficient heating system he had documented in 12 years of inspections. None of that would have mattered if the windows had frosted over, but they did not. By the time spring arrived, 7 families had started building Double-Flue chimneys. 3 finished before the next winter. 2 gave up halfway through because the trench work was harder than expected. 1 built the chimney, but skipped the preheat channel and complained that it did not work as well. The builder said that was because he had built half a system and expected full results. The man said he did not have time to argue about it. He cut extra wood instead. The helper built his own version the following summer. He made the firebox slightly larger and added a 3rd damper to fine-tune the preheat airflow. It worked. He burned even less wood than the builder had. The skeptic wrote a formal report to the county office, recommending that the Double-Flue design be included in the standard construction guidelines for high-altitude cabins. The county office acknowledged the report and filed it. Nothing changed at the policy level. Individual families kept building them anyway. The builder kept teaching school. He kept refining the design in his notebooks. He sketched variations with triple flues, with different stone types, with adjustable channel depths. Most of them stayed on paper. A few got built by people who understood what they were trying to solve. The system worked best for families who were willing to dig the trench, maintain the dampers, and think about heat as something that moved in patterns instead of something that just happened. For people who wanted a fire to feel like a fire and did not care about efficiency, the design was irrelevant. For people who counted every log and planned every winter, it was the difference between comfort and crisis. The technique faded when oil heat arrived. Digging trenches and stacking fieldstone could not compete with a thermostat and a fuel truck. The families who had built Double-Flue chimneys kept using them as long as the structures stood. But their children moved to town, and their grandchildren did not know the systems existed. The physics did not change. The constant temperature of the earth below the frost line was still 45 degrees. Cold air still sank. Heat still rose. The principles worked the same in 1912 as they did a century later. What changed was whether anyone thought the effort was worth it. The schoolteacher's cabin stood for 31 years. The chimney never cracked. The preheat channel never froze. When the structure was finally torn down to make room for a larger building, the new owner salvaged the stone and built a standard single-flue chimney. He said the old design was interesting, but outdated. He burned twice as much wood that winter and complained about the cost. Some lessons take longer. To learn that the principle that survived longest was not the Double-Flue design itself, but the mindset behind it. A few builders in other valleys heard about the schoolteacher's chimney and tried their own versions. Most of them failed because they changed too many variables at once, or did not understand which parts of the system mattered. One family in Lake Placid dug the preheat trench, but used clay pipe instead of stone channel. The clay cracked the first winter and flooded the cellar with cold air. Another builder in Saranac Lake copied the Double-Flues, but skipped the earth coupling entirely, venting both flues straight up through the roof. He got better draft than a standard chimney, but none of the fuel savings. The system only worked when all three elements were present: the earth-coupled preheat, the separated flues, and the thermal mass of the stone itself. Leave out any one piece, and the efficiency collapsed. The schoolteacher wrote a short explanation of the design and submitted it to a regional building journal in 1913. The editor rejected it, saying the concept was too complex for general readers and lacked sufficient documentation. The letter sat in a desk drawer for 6 years. When the editor retired and his replacement sorted through the backlog, he found the manuscript and published it in a winter issue, with a note saying the technique might be of historical interest. 3 builders wrote letters in response. 2 of them said they had tried similar approaches and encountered problems with moisture condensation in the preheat channel. The third said he had built a working version in 1889 and used it for 18 years before moving to a larger house. His design used a longer trench and a shallower depth, only 4 feet instead of 6. But the results were similar: consistent heat, minimal smoke, and dramatic fuel savings. He included measurements. His system preheated incoming air to 38 degrees in January and maintained an indoor temperature of 56 degrees with 1/3 the firewood his neighbors used. He noted that the key challenge was not the construction, but the maintenance. The channel had to be inspected every autumn and cleared of any debris or blockages. If mice nested in the trench or roots grew into the stonework, the airflow dropped and the system lost efficiency. He also mentioned that the design worked best in climates with deep frost lines and stable subsoil. In areas where the ground froze all the way down or where drainage was poor, the channel could freeze or flood. The schoolteacher read the letter and wrote back. The 2 men exchanged technical notes for several months, comparing trench depths, stone types, and damper configurations. The correspondence continued until the other builder died in 1921. The letters were saved by his daughter and donated to a county historical society in 1947, where they remained unfiled in a storage box for decades. The practical impact of the Double-Flue chimney was limited to the families who built it and the neighbors who watched it work. By 1920, 7 cabins in the valley used variations of the design. By 1930, that number had dropped to 4. The others had been abandoned or converted to standard chimneys when new owners took over. The remaining systems kept running because the people who used them understood the maintenance and valued the results. They checked the trench every fall, cleaned the dampers, and monitored the airflow. They knew that the system required attention, but rewarded it with consistent performance. The skeptic, the town official who had argued against the design in 1912, built his own version in 1923 after a particularly harsh winter forced him to burn through his entire woodpile by February. He hired the schoolteacher to supervise the construction. The system worked exactly as described. He never publicly acknowledged that he had been wrong, but he stopped criticizing the design and recommended it to 2 other families who asked his opinion. That was as close to an endorsement as he ever gave. The helper, the neighbor who had assisted with the original build, became the go-to person for anyone in the valley who wanted to replicate the system. He built 3 more Double-Flue chimneys between 1913 and 1917, each one slightly refined, based on lessons from the previous builds. He learned that the trench needed a slight upward slope toward the firebox to prevent water from pooling. He learned that the channel worked best when lined with flat stones rather than rounded river rock, because the flat surfaces created less turbulence and allowed smoother airflow. He learned that the damper in the preheat flue needed to be larger than the damper in the exhaust flue to allow for volume expansion as the air warmed. None of these details were in the original design. They emerged through use and observation. The schoolteacher incorporated them into his notes and updated his sketches. He considered writing a second article for the building journal, but decided against it. The first submission had taken months to prepare and had been rejected. The second attempt felt like wasted effort. Instead, he focused on teaching the principles to anyone who asked. He explained the physics in simple terms. Cold air is heavy, warm air is light, and the earth holds a constant temperature below the frost line. If you use those three facts together, you can preheat combustion air without burning extra fuel. The explanation took 5 minutes. The construction took 3 weeks. The results lasted decades. The system's greatest limitation was scale. It worked well for small cabins and single-room structures where the heat load was modest and the firebox was sized accordingly. It worked poorly for larger homes with multiple rooms or high ceilings because the preheated air volume was not sufficient to meet the demand. A few builders tried to scale up the design by adding multiple preheat channels or enlarging the trench, but the results were inconsistent. The larger systems required more maintenance, more careful balancing of the dampers, and more attention to airflow. Most people concluded that the effort was not worth it and reverted to standard chimneys or switched to coal stoves. The schoolteacher's cabin remained the most successful example. It was small enough that the system could handle the full heat load, well built enough that the stonework stayed intact, and maintained carefully enough that the airflow never degraded. Visitors who stepped inside on a January night found the air warm and dry, the fire burning cleanly, and the woodpile lasting far longer than seemed possible. Some of them built their own versions. Most of them just enjoyed the warmth and went home to their drafty standard chimneys. The difference between knowing something works and being willing to do the work to make it work remained the dividing line. By the winter of 1914, 11 families in the Adirondacks region had built double-flue chimneys with preheat channels. 8 of them were direct copies of the schoolteacher's design. 3 were modified versions that incorporated different stone types or shorter trenches. The results varied. The families who followed the design exactly and maintained the dampers properly reported fuel savings between 60 and 75% compared to their previous chimneys. The families who shortened the trench or skipped the gravel base reported smaller savings, usually between 30 and 40%. One family who built the chimney but never learned to adjust the dampers properly saw no improvement at all and blamed the design. The schoolteacher visited that cabin in February and spent an hour explaining the damper settings. He showed them how to open the preheat damper wider during the coldest hours and how to close it partially during mild weather to prevent overheating. He demonstrated the difference by adjusting the settings while they watched. Within 20 minutes, the fire burned hotter and cleaner. The family apologized for the criticism and asked him to check their stonework. He found 2 gaps in the flue liner where mortar had cracked. He patched them with fresh mortar mixed from lime and sand. The system worked properly after that. The incident reinforced a lesson he had learned during the first winter. The design was only as good as the execution and the maintenance. A poorly built chimney with a preheat channel performed worse than a well-built standard chimney. The innovation was not a replacement for craftsmanship. It was an addition to it. The families who understood that distinction succeeded. The families who expected the design to compensate for poor construction or poor maintenance were disappointed. Word of the system spread slowly beyond the immediate valley. A few trappers and loggers who passed through the region during the winter months saw the chimneys and asked questions. Some of them built versions in remote cabins further north. The schoolteacher never saw those structures and never knew if they worked. He heard occasional reports through travelers, some positive and some skeptical, but he had no way to verify them. The lack of documentation frustrated him. He wanted to compile a record of every installation, every modification, and every outcome. But the distances were too great, and the communication too sparse. He settled for keeping detailed notes on his own system, and on the systems built by families close enough to visit. The following winter brought another cold snap, though not as severe as the record event. Temperatures dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 consecutive nights. The schoolteacher's cabin maintained an interior temperature of 68 degrees, with the fire banked low overnight. He burned 3 logs per night, instead of the usual 6 that a standard chimney would have required. The helper, who had built his own double-flue system the previous spring, reported similar results. The skeptic, still using his original chimney, burned through his entire January wood supply by the 3rd week of the month and had to borrow logs from a neighbor. He never mentioned the loan publicly, but the schoolteacher heard about it through the helper. The skeptic's resistance finally broke in March. He appeared at the schoolteacher's door on a Saturday morning and asked if the offer to help build a new chimney was still open. The schoolteacher said it was. They started the following week. The skeptic's cabin required a complete teardown of the existing chimney and a rebuild from the foundation up. The work took 19 days. The schoolteacher supervised the stonework and the flue placement. The helper assisted with the trench excavation and the gravel base. The skeptic provided the labor and the materials. He did not apologize for the previous criticism, but he listened carefully to every instruction and followed the design exactly. When the mortar cured and the first fire was lit, the system worked as intended. The skeptic stood in front of the hearth for 10 minutes, watching the flames and feeling the heat. He said nothing. The schoolteacher and the helper gathered their tools and left. 3 days later, the skeptic stopped by the school during the lunch hour and left a note on the desk. It read, "You were right about the physics. I should have built this 2 years ago." The schoolteacher kept the note in his desk drawer. It was the closest thing to validation he ever received from an official source. The technique continued to spread through the valley over the next several years, though never widely. By the winter of 1918, 14 families were using double-flue chimneys with preheat channels. 5 more were planning to build them the following spring. The total represented less than a quarter of the households in the region, but it was enough to establish the design as a legitimate option, rather than an eccentric experiment. The schoolteacher continued to refine his understanding of the system through observation and measurement. He discovered that the preheat channel's performance varied depending on soil composition. Sandy soil with good drainage allowed the trench to maintain a more stable temperature throughout the winter. Clay soil with poor drainage sometimes developed ice pockets that restricted airflow. He recommended adding drainage tiles alongside the trench in areas with heavy clay, a modification that solved the problem in 3 cabins that had experienced reduced performance. He also learned that the channel depth mattered more than he had initially calculated. Trenches dug to 4 feet reached the constant earth temperature reliably in most soil types. Trenches dug to only 3 feet sometimes failed to stay above freezing during extended cold snaps, especially in exposed locations with thin snow cover. He updated his notes to specify a minimum depth of 4 feet and recommended 5 feet in areas with known shallow frost penetration. The damper mechanism remained the most frequent point of failure. Several families reported that their dampers rusted or warped within the first 2 years, especially in chimneys that burned green wood or softwoods that produced more creosote. The schoolteacher experimented with different metals and found that cast iron dampers lasted longer than sheet metal dampers. But they were heavier and more expensive. He designed a simpler damper using a flat stone slab mounted on a pivot rod, a design that cost nothing and lasted indefinitely if the stone was cut properly. 4 families adopted the stone damper design and reported good results. One family tried to use a wooden damper and had to replace it after 6 months when it charred and cracked. The schoolteacher added a note to his records: no wood components in direct contact with flue gases. The maintenance schedule he developed became standard among the families using the system. Clean the preheat channel in late spring after the last fire. Inspect the flue liner for cracks in early autumn before the first cold weather. Check the damper operation monthly during the heating season. Rebuild the gravel base every 5 years if settling or erosion was evident. The families who followed the schedule had systems that worked reliably for decades. The families who skipped maintenance had systems that degraded and eventually failed. The schoolteacher began to notice patterns in who adopted the system and who did not. Families with young children or elderly members were more likely to build double-flue chimneys because the improved fuel efficiency reduced the physical burden of wood gathering, and the stable heat reduced health risks. Single men and transient workers were less likely to invest the time because they did not expect to stay in one location long enough to justify the effort. Wealthier families who could afford coal or who hired labor for wood cutting saw little advantage in the design. The system appealed most to those who were permanent residents, who cut their own wood, and who valued self-sufficiency over convenience. Geography also played a role. Families living in sheltered valleys with access to dense timber stands were less motivated to adopt the innovation because fuel was abundant and the effort to haul logs was minimal. Families living on exposed ridges or in areas where timber was sparse recognized the value immediately. The schoolteacher's own location fell into the latter category. His cabin sat on a low rise with thin soil and scattered hardwoods. Gathering a winter's supply of firewood required weeks of work. The double-flue chimney reduced that burden by more than half. For him, the innovation was not optional. It was survival. The helper's situation was similar. He lived on a rocky hillside where the nearest good timber was a mile away by foot. Cutting and hauling wood consumed most of his autumn. The fuel savings from the preheat channel gave him time to prepare other necessities for winter: preserving food, repairing tools, reinforcing the cabin against wind. He told the schoolteacher that the chimney had bought him an extra month of productive time every year. That time, he said, was more valuable than the wood itself. The skeptics' conversion added credibility to the design among other officials and longtime residents. His endorsement was quiet, but effective. He did not promote the system publicly, but when asked for his opinion, he admitted that it worked and that he wished he had built it sooner. That honest assessment carried weight among people who had dismissed the schoolteacher's initial claims as unproven theory. 3 county officials built double-flue chimneys between 1918 and 1920. None of them credited the schoolteacher by name, but the designs were unmistakably his. The technique remained in use in the valley through the 1920s and into the early 1930s. Then, oil furnaces arrived. The first installation happened in 1933, in a new house built by a family from Albany. The furnace required no wood cutting, no daily tending, no damper adjustments, and no maintenance beyond an annual inspection. Within 5 years, half the households in the valley had switched to oil heat. The families with double-flue chimneys continued using them, but they stopped building new ones. When those families sold their properties or passed away, the new owners often converted back to standard chimneys or installed oil systems. The knowledge of how to build and maintain the preheat channels faded. By 1940, only 3 of the original 14 installations were still in active use. The schoolteacher's cabin was one of them. He never switched to oil. He understood the appeal of automatic heat, but he preferred the system he had built and tested. He knew its rhythms, its quirks, and its limits. He trusted it. The cabin stayed warm through every winter, until he died in 1946. The property was sold the following spring. The new owner dismantled the Double-Flue chimney and built a conventional fireplace in its place. The stones were reused. The design was forgotten. The principles that made the system work, the constant temperature of deep earth, the weight of cold air, the rise of heated gases, remained true. Physics does not change with fashion. The innovation disappeared not because it failed, but because easier options became available. For 2 decades, in one remote valley, a handful of families heated their homes with half the firewood their neighbors required. They did it by thinking differently about a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. That difference, brief as it was, mattered. The end.